We will start with the session 5, the idea of classics in ancient literature and art. And we will invite Professor David Holton, Emeritus Professor of Modern Greek, University of Cambridge, a very well-known scholar. We are grateful to you, David, as well. And he's going to talk about the reception of classical antiquity in early modern Greek writing. Please, take the floor.
Kalimera και από μένα. Good morning, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm afraid, just talk. The subject indicated by my title is potentially vast, so some limitation is required. I'm restricting myself to texts written in the vernacular to be read or listened to by Greek speakers of limited education. So I'm excluding the work of Greek scholars who could read classical texts in the original and comment on them, continuing the mission of Renaissance humanists and, of course, their Byzantine predecessors. My interest is to what extent the knowledge of classical and post-classical literary texts was transferred to a wider audience during the early modern period through the medium of translation. A key figure in the 16th century is Nikolaos Sofianos, born to a noble family in Corfu in the early 1500s. It's possible, though not confirmed, that he studied at the Greek Gymnasium in Rome, founded by Pope Leo X in 1514. He was certainly a pupil of Zacharias Kaliergis, who played an important role in the development of Greek printing in Venice. Sofianos was also involved in printing, but for a number of years he earned a living as a manuscript copyist and as a dealer in manuscripts. On a trip to Greece to collect manuscripts in 1543, he observed the lamentable state of education in Greece, which of course was under Ottoman rule at the time, and he vowed to do something about it. In a dedicatory epistle to the bishop of Milopotamos and Chersonissos, he lists the learned Greeks whom he has consulted and declares that they all share his view that the educational problem of the Greeks could be solved if they were able to read and listen to the books which those virtuous men of ancient times had created. To this end, he writes, I've set out to translate and put into plain language some of the books which are useful and beneficial in order that this pitiable race, to elianon genos in Greek, may be renewed and rise up from the great lack of education. His first attempt is a short text wrongly attributed to Plutarch entitled On the Education of Children, Peri Pedon Agogis, which he published in Venice in January 1545. He proposed to continue his project with translation of the other works of Plutarch and the dialogues of Lucian, but this never happened. Nor was his pseudo-Plutarchan work ever reprinted. Was it a commercial failure? Did he become disillusioned? Sofianos' name is last recorded in 1552, so he may have died at a relatively early age, even for those times, and that would explain why his project was never continued. Let me insert a parenthesis at this point to consider the history of the word klassikos in Greek. It is, of course, Latin in origin, from the noun klassis, class, army, or fleet. The adjective means high class, superior, but it's not recorded with reference to older respected authors until the 2nd century AD in the Attic Nights of Aulus Gellius. Classicus aliquis scriptor, some classical author. The word is borrowed into Greek at some point, but not with the sense that it has today. The wonderful lexicon of Byzantine Greek published by the Austrian Academy has only one citation of this word, with the sense zur Flotte gehörig, belonging to the fleet, because that's the original meaning well, one of the original meanings of the Latin word. That is dated to the 6th century AD, and there's another inscription at Abydos of the same period, which also contains the word as a noun, indicating the official who collected tolls from ships passing through the Hellespont. But there's no evidence for the use of klassikos to refer to classical antiquity in the Byzantine period at all. By the 17th century, of course, we can find the word in Neo-Latin in the phrase scriptores classici, and from Latin it was soon adopted and adapted into French and subsequently other languages, including English, but in modern Greek, it seems not before the 19th century. At least I haven't been able to identify an occurrence of the word in Greek before the 19th century, unless Pascalis can help me. To return to our theme, before the initiative of Sophianos in the 1540s, there had been some earlier attempts to publish classical or post-classical works in modern Greek translation, some of them with conspicuous success. The Iliad was the first known case, published in a paraphrase by Nikolaos Lucanis in 1526. He based his text on an earlier paraphrase from the late Byzantine period, but his modernized version has been proclaimed as the first translation of the Iliad into a modern language. Actually, the language is hardly the vernacular, and it's more of an adaptation than a translation, although it does follow the Homeric structure and sequence of events rather closely. Because he retained some of the Homeric vocabulary and other learnedisms, however, Lucanis had to provide his readers with a glossary, 11 pages of words that they might not know, with a translation into the Greek vernacular. It's a lavish production with 138 woodcuts especially executed for this project. The two reprints, much later in the next century, 1603 and 1640, were of inferior quality, but they indicate that Lucanis's work was still of interest in the following century, providing, as it did, access to the story of the Trojan War in a modern Greek translation. 3 years after Lucanis's Iliad, another work on an ancient subject appeared in print. This was a vernacular version in rhymed couplets of the Alexander Romance, not history, but romanticized history, the origins of which go back to around 300 AD. This is a verse text narrating many of the fantastic exploits attributed to Alexander the Great. His taming of the horse Bucephalus, his defeat of Darius and his marriage to Darius' daughter Roxane, his journey to the Indus, his discovery and subsequent loss of the water of life, his encounter with the Amazons and then the Brahmins, and concludes with his death in Babylon and burial in Alexandria. It enjoyed considerable popularity, being printed at least 17 times, the latest in 1805. From around 1680, it was in competition with a prose version of the Alexander Romance, known as the chapbook of Alexander the Great, Philada de Megalexandrou, which enjoyed immense popularity until the 20th century. The poet Seferis even mentions it being hawked by peddlers during his childhood in Smyrna. But to return to the 16th century and to attempts to make classical texts available in modern linguistic garb. The next one might be considered a rather odd choice, This is a version of the pseudo-Homeric Battle of the Frogs and Mice, Vatrachomiomachia, composed in rhymed 15-syllable verses by Demetrios Xenos of Zakynthos, who was a major figure in the early history of Greek printing for Greek readers. The original text was possibly composed in the 2nd or 3rd century BC. It's a parody of Homeric style and language, a kind of mock epic involving a war between the mice and the frogs. This amusing little poem was deftly adapted by Xenos into modern Greek. It was published in 1539, probably bound together with another animal story, which features a donkey, a wolf, and a fox. This latter poem, by an anonymous Cretan, is a satire with various social and religious targets. It proved to be extremely popular, being reprinted 15 times after that first edition. It's not based on a classical text, but belongs to the tradition of animal fables, particularly those in which the underdog, or in this case the underdonkey, proves to be the victor, thanks to his cunning or persistence and the vanity and overconfidence of his opponents. These two poems featuring animals bring us naturally to a classic Greek text, indeed both classic and classical, Aesop's fables, mythi. A modern Greek version, translated by the Corphiot Andronikos Nukios, appeared in 1543. We may recall that Caxton's English translation of Aesop was published in 1484, so only 60 years later. According to the most recent editor, the modern Greek translation is careless and sometimes based on a misunderstanding of the ancient Greek. Nonetheless, it's curious that there is no evidence for a second edition in the 16th century, because one would have expected there to be a demand. But it may simply be that no copy survives. Editions could simply disappear if they were sold out and those rather fragile copies were lost or destroyed. In the next 3 centuries, however, Nukios's Aesop was reprinted repeatedly, a total of 27 editions, the last dated 1862. So these 5 texts that I've mentioned, the Iliad, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice, the Alexander Romance, the Fables of Aesop, and the Pseudo-Plutarchon on the education of children, are the sum total of ancient Greek works that were published in modern Greek versions in the course of the 16th century. Thanks to the invention of printing, literary texts could now circulate much more widely. The first printed book in modern Greek was actually published in 1509, but it was only from the 1520s that presses specializing in books for Greek readers came into existence. The great majority of the literary texts in modern Greek published in Venice were not translations of classical works. 2 categories predominate: romances, such as Imperios and Margarona and Apollonius, and religious or moralizing works, like The Flower of Virtues, Instruction of a Father to His Son, the Old and New Testament retold, and the story of Susanna. Some of these were adapted from Italian originals. It's clear that entertainment and instructional literature accounted for a greater proportion of the output of the presses rather than classical texts in modern Greek garb. And the majority were in verse rather than prose. But further interlingual translations of ancient Greek classics do not seem to have been attempted, at least not in print, for several centuries. The first significant example takes us to the 19th century, when Ioannis Villaras published in 1814 his translations of Anacreon, a Platonic dialogue, the Kriton, and the funeral speech of Pericles from Thucydides' history, as well as that old favorite, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice. Then in 1835, the Hecuba, Ekavi of Euripides, was put into modern Greek verse by Ioannis Chaviaras and published at his own expense in Vienna. As far as I can tell, that was the first modern Greek translation of an ancient Greek drama. Despite the absence of translations in the intervening centuries, a knowledge of the ancient world was not lacking among the educated classes, nowhere more so than in Venetian-ruled Crete, where a literary renaissance flowered for almost 100 years from the late 16th century. The urban elite knew Italian, of course, and many had studied in Italy. Thus, they were familiar with the cultural world of classical antiquity, both Greek and Roman. Writers brought it into their plays, dramatic interludes, and narrative poems in various ways. Retellings of ancient myths can be found in interludes that would have been performed between the acts of plays. The subjects include Glaucus and Scylla, Jason and Medea, Pyramus and Thisbe, Perseus and Andromeda, and the Judgment of Paris. These particular interludes are the work of Iorios Chortatsis, the most prolific of the Cretan playwrights, to judge from surviving works. He had a particular source for these themes, the Metamorphoses of Ovid. So, ancient Greek myths via Latin, and indeed an Italian adaptation of Ovid by Giovanni Andrea dell'Anguillara, published in 1561. Chortatsis takes a light-hearted approach, despite the gravity of some of the subjects. The emphasis is on entertainment and theatricality. The tragedy Erophili, also by Chortatsis, is set in Memphis, Egypt, at some indeterminate date, but the atmosphere is classical. There are frequent references to Zeus, Pluto, Hades, and Eros as the cause of the conflict between love and filial duty. To take another example, in the comedy Fortunatos by Marcos Antonios Foskolos, written perhaps 50 years after the plays of Chortatsis, the braggart soldier compares himself to Heracles, Hector, Achilles, Rhodomonte, from Ariosto, Nimrod, and the Trojan Aeneas. The pedantic schoolmaster mixes Latin and Italian with his Greek and claims to know Homer and Virgil by heart. And he says he doesn't need Cicero to support his oratory. In the comedies, such references are mere name-dropping, part of the humor. But of course, they need to be recognized by the audience if they're going to be effective. Another Cretan text, the poetic romance Eratokritos by Vitsentzos Kornaros, contains several mythological allusions which have to be teased out by the reader. The hero, Eratokritos, says that his love for Arethusa has given his mind wings which carry him up to the sky. But then the sun burns his wings and he falls headlong to the earth, an obvious reference to the myth of Icarus and Daedalus, which of course takes place in Crete. And this encourages the reader to compare the characters of Icarus and Eratokritos. Again, we find incorporated in the poem a retelling of the myth of Cephalus and Procris, but with the part of Cephalus assumed by one of the participants in the tournament, who is in perpetual mourning for his wife, whom he accidentally killed. There's a telling coincidence of detail, but it's up to the reader to identify the story and then to ponder the similarities and the significance of this episode for a reading of the whole poem. Finally, Kornaros sets his story in Athens, to which he attributes the nourishment of learning, the throne of power, the river of knowledge. And it's ruled by a king called Iraklis, which sounds suspiciously like Heracles. We think we're in classical Athens, but there are palaces, noblemen taking part in a tournament, and the hero serenades his beloved, accompanying himself on the lute. This all seems quite medieval, but one of the prospective participants in the tournament is a Karamanitis, in other words, a Turk, and consequently a potential threat in the aftermath of the Battle of Lepanto. He's contrasted with the next competitor to arrive, who is the son of the king, of Byzantium. This ahistorical mishmash has puzzled many critics. Is Kornaros really talking about his own times, perhaps? Does Athens stand in for Venice? Should we read the whole poem as an allegory? Cretan Renaissance literature is complex. Deeply indebted to the Italian Renaissance, but at the same time conscious of its essential Greekness and its classical heritage. Time to draw some conclusions. I've painted two very different pictures. First, the 16th century up to its last decades, where we can identify tentative steps to bring classical literature to the masses, thanks to the initiative of Greeks in Venice and the opportunities offered by the printing press. Secondly, the more confident period that begins towards the end of the 16th century, with its focus on Crete, a more subtle engagement with the classical past, and the revival of the classical genres of tragedy and comedy, mediated by the Italian Renaissance. But the number of classical texts that were actually published in modern Greek versions is depressingly small. No drama, no historians, no Demosthenes, no Plato. Whether there were simply no educated Greeks capable of producing the translations, or printers and publishers prepared to take on the commercial risk, we don't know. But we can at least admire the initiative of the few pioneers, like Demetrios Xenos, who prefaced his translation of The Battle of the Frogs and Mice with this verse dialogue between a customer and a bookseller. The customer says, "Have you by any chance any good book, a new one I can purchase?" "Certainly, I've a lovely one. Just take a look at this, please." "Tell me the title of the book. I'm in an awful hurry. There's urgent business to be done. I can't delay here reading." "The Battle of the Frogs and Mice by the most learned Homer." "That sort of thing's no good to me. It's far too deep and complex." "By no means. It's quite simple now because it's been translated. It was in hexametric verse, now it's in rhyming couplets." "In rhyme, you say? Then, my good man, give me a copy quickly. Don't delay. How much is it? Take what you like in payment. But tell me this before I go. Answer one little question. Who turned the poem from ancient Greek into these rhyming verses? You're well acquainted with the man. He is a friend of yours, sir, Demetrios from Zakynthos, and his surname is Xenos. Thank you.
As a chair, I am in an awful position because I have to stop people who you can't see every day. I would like to thank Professor David Holton. It's really a famous professor. He has written the best modern Greek grammar with Peter Makridge and Irini Filippaki-Warburton. And then he directed another big project, and the result was 4 volumes, the Cambridge Grammar of Medieval and Early Modern Greek. Thank you, David, for what you have done for Greek language and Greek culture. And now, Professor Theodoros Papanghelis, I have to say nothing about the personality of the speaker, only that as a member of the Academy of Athens, he has done a lot here in the Academy and for the Greek language as a president of the Center of the Greek Language. Please. Take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a Latinist, I was going to tell you an anecdote about what classical antiquity means to Greeks of today, but I will skip it because I don't want to exceed my time limits. In any case, I'm always tempted when speaking in Greece to throw in a few good words for that unimaginative, imitative, late-coming tribe inhabiting the Italian peninsula. Classical antiquity has not been exempt from modern scholarly debates marked by a principled resistance to assumptions long treated as self-evident. A preliminary distinction must be drawn between classical as a purely chronological designation and classic as a qualitative term, denoting, among other things, durability, longevity, authority, and exemplary status. Yet even when this distinction is rigorously maintained, new approaches to and reassessments of classical antiquity inevitably bear upon the concept of the classic itself, insofar as one of the central premises of such debates is that value is historically contingent rather than intrinsic. Antiquity is no longer viewed as a repository of timeless values, but rather as a historically situated system of values with which we are encouraged to engage reflexively without being constrained by inherited notions of intrinsic worth. We are urged to refrain from what is often characterized as a rhetoric of a predominantly white European elite, a rhetoric that allegedly obscures the relational nature of value. Value for whom? We are further called upon to recognize that our conception of the classic is the product of a long and complex history of interpretive mediation, of the influence of cultural and political institutions that have shaped and policed our understanding of antiquity, of changing perspectives on temporality, of pressures to expand the category of the classic beyond the Western cultural sphere, and not least by an imperative toward inclusivity driven by new social sensibilities. It is not unreasonable to suppose that some practitioners of classics may experience a degree of unease, wondering whether such repositioning risks drawing an uncomfortably thin line between an overly sophisticated, open-ended relativism on the one hand and the effective disestablishment of the classic on the other. Scholarship, one must admit, is nourished by such shifts of paradigm, and there is always room for evaluations. But then the question arises whether in our anxiety to avoid the constraints of inherited value systems, we risk replacing them with the equally binding limitations of our own historical situatedness. Let me try if I can read better without those glasses. Be that as it may, the argument that follows proceeds from the assumption that the available evidence suggests that antiquity articulated its idea of the classic with substantial emphasis on the qualities mentioned above, namely durability, longevity, permanent significance. Of course, as you heard from David Holton just a little ago, the word classic does not appear, but the word canonical after the Hellenistic period is more or less corresponding to what we mean by classic today. Focusing in particular on the Roman conception of the classic, I suggest that temporal distance from Greek classical models, far from prompting a reflexive interrogation of the concept, served instead to consolidate those criteria even further. When Propertius, the elegiac poet, writes, "Shades of Callimachus and Coanphiletus, allow me to enter your grove," it becomes clear that temporal distance as a touchstone of classicity applies not only to monumental figures such as Homer and Callimachus, but also to poets of comparatively lesser renown. Indeed, one often gains the impression that the ultimate criterion is quite simply being Grecian. Now, Greek poets frequently express confidence in the durability of their fame and present themselves as classics whose spiritual and aesthetic value will transcend time. The anticipation that song will resonate with future generations, thereby bestowing immortal fame on those sung off, is clearly voiced by the Homeric Helen. Future generations will sing of us. Pronouncements to this effect are often framed through an explicit or implicit contrast between the immortality of verse and the perishability of material achievements. Pindar rings the changes on the idea that without songs immortalizing power, men of virtue and great deeds are consigned to oblivion. And similar statements are to be found in Bacchylides, Simonides, Sappho, and Theodoros. The promise of lasting remembrance through poetry and the concomitant superiority of literary achievement over mundane pursuits represents the furthest horizon envisaged by Greek poets vying for classic status. This noble claim was naturally taken up by the Romans, but in Rome, ideology and geopolitics endowed it with a new intensity and transposed it to a different scale. In Horace' Odes 1:1, the first ode of the three-book collection, the dense concentration of Greek vocabulary and the traditional imagery of poetic consecration, the sacred grove of poetic inspiration with its habitual residence, the prestige of the emblematic lesbian Varvitos, they all culminate with a reference to the Alexandrian canon of the lyric elite. In fact, Horace claims a double authorization. Learnedness and refinement, he says, doctarum frontium, as well as the fastidious distancing from the common herd, the vulgus, signal his allegiance to Callimachian aesthetics and add another feather to his classics cap. His stance in Odes 1:1 rests on an ocean of classicity grounded not merely in antiquity, but also in stylistic excellence. Here the Roman poet appears more or less content to remain within the ambit outlined by his Greek lyric models. The theme of the permanent glory of song across time attains new intensity in the Sfragis, the last poem of the three-book collection of Odes, poem 330. Horace is here likely indebted to Pindar, yet his imagery is notably starker. I mean Pindar Pythian 6. His poetic monument will defy corrosive rain and surpass the pyramids in height and duration to remain unscathed in secula seculorum. As in his Greek predecessors, poetry figures as a superior and more enduring form of power, yet in this ode it contracts explicit political associations by being measured against tangible symbols of royal and imperial authority. This political analog emerges fully in lines 7-9, where the fate of Horace's poetry is coterminous with that of the Roman Imperium. Unlike his Greek models, Horace does not speak in abstracto. He explicitly declares pride in his meteoric ascent from humble origins to become the lyric voice of all Italy, and by implication of the empire. No Greek predecessor appears to have advanced the claim of such comprehensive and territorially defined classicity. In this respect, Horace's adaptation of Greek poetic self-legitimation constitutes not merely a continuation of tradition, but a decisive reconfiguration of its scope and ambition. Homeric figures such as Selene and Achilles anticipate poetic afterlives, thereby vicariously expressing the poet's awareness of a tradition of song extending into the future. However, epic convention affords poets little opportunity to speak in their own voice. It is therefore striking when Virgil does so in Aeneid, 9th book of the Aeneid, the epilogue to the Nisus and Euryalus episode. Fortunati, fortunate pair, your love story will live as long there is a Roman Empire. As in the Iliad, this moment of poetic self-reflection is triggered by the story of an erotic pair, like Helen and Paris. Nisus and Euryalus are promised immortality, so long as the house of Aeneas stands and Roman rule remains secure. Their fame is thus historically contextualized and conditioned upon the survival of the central symbol of Roman military and political power. Epic Virgil is in tune with lyric Horace. The idea of poetry's inherent ability to resist time also informs Ovid's Amores 1, poem 15, where the poet articulates a sharp opposition between the fama perennis, the eternal glory afforded by a poetic achievement, and the mortale opus of military and political careers. His derogatory characterization of the latter, dusty prizes of military activity, verbose laws, constitutes one of the most emphatic statements in Augustan poetry, asserting the moral and indeed ontological superiority of intellectual pursuits over what are conventionally regarded as megala erga. This valuation is reinforced by the extensive catalogue of Greek and Roman literary authorities presented in the elegy. Ovid characteristically reduces each poet's achievement to a defining thematic core. And when he comes to Virgil's poetic corpus, he takes up the "as long as the empire stands" theme, and does so in the most triumphalist tone. People will be reading about Tityrus, the crops, and Aeneas' arms, so long as Rome will hold dominion over a conquered world. Roma triumphati dum caput orbis erat, to allow some Latin to be heard in the room. This is special treatment. Ovid nudges his reader to view Virgil as the classical empire, and he's generous enough to allow the contingent of Greek poets to aspire to worldwide readership on the coattails of their Roman colleagues, all in all a publisher's wild fantasy. And several years later, putting the seal on his own magnum opus, Ovid claims for himself every single medal from Virgil's decoration, immortality of fame, and worldwide fans. Quaque patet domitis Romana potentia terris, in every single corner of the world ruled by Rome. I am approaching the end of my the Cerberus of timekeeping is looking very, very austerely at me. Horace, Virgil, and Ovid aligned themselves with Greek literary authorities' claim that the power of poetry transcends time, yet they also seem to blur the clarity of the picture by situating the impact of their poetry within the historical, political context of imperial ideology. I believe it would be disproportionate to view this as a downright contradiction. The Augustans do not so much give up the idea of poetry's permanence as they place it within an ideological project that itself claims endurance in more concrete geopolitical terms. Sticking to the unconditionality and the metaphysical abstractness, so to speak, of the Greek idea, would be to fail to acknowledge the power structures and narratives from within which the Augustan poets speak. After all, the geopolitical reality and the historical world ruled by Rome allowed them to calibrate a more concrete idea of universal classicity. And geopolitics apart, other more cultural narratives of their days were informed by the very same idea. The laudatory phrase, omne evum tribus explicare cartis, to recount the whole world in 3 books in the dedicatory prologue to Catullus' collection of poems, does not point to an historiographic project peculiar to Cornelius Nepos, but rather to the kind of universal history exemplified by Castor of Rhodes's work, second quarter of the 1st century, this Castor. The latter's chronological tables sought to align Greek, Roman, and Eastern histories within a single temporal framework. As Barchesi observes, Castor aimed to link Assyrian royal chronicles with Greek history and ultimately with Roman consular fasti. This project informed Varro's De Gente Populi Romani and reflects a broader impulse to subsume diverse temporalities within the imaginative horizon of Roman power. Castor thus earned the epithet Philo-Romeos, while Horace, Virgil, and Ovid could lay claim to world classicity. In his 1944 address to the Virgil Society, titled What is a Classic?, T.S. Eliot identifies depth of literary self-awareness and historically grounded universality as key criteria of the classic. All 3 Augustan poets write in full consciousness of a long Greek and Roman literary tradition at a moment when imperial expansion fosters the sense of a shared cultural space. Greeks and Romans shared a common idea of the classic. Yet, those who breathed what Edgar Allan Poe famously called the grandeur that was Rome were able to inflect that idea with an ambition and scope beyond the reach of the glory that was Greece. Thank you.
I was wondering what geopolitical twist is, and Professor Papanghelis explained that in a wonderful way. Thank you. And now, Professor Tim Whitmarsh, Regius Professor of Greek in the University of Cambridge, will give a very interesting talk about Christianity and the classical world. I would like to stress the fact that our distinguished guest is editor-in-chief of the English Classical Dictionary in Cambridge, and has done a lot of research, and is very young indeed. By this age, he has done a lot of high-quality scientific work. Thanks a lot, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here at this historic event, and it's a great pleasure always to be back in Athens. I'm going to be speaking to you today as a classicist with an interest in the emergence of early Christianity. But first, let me begin with some reflections on what it is to be a classicist, a scholar of the ancient Mediterranean. I take it that this is in the spirit of the conference, which has seen an impressive amount of meditation on the question of what it is that we seek to know from our fields, and why, to what end. Yesterday, for example, we heard from our scientific colleagues their reflections on the epistemological assumptions that underlie their disciplines. The distinction between nature and technology, for example, or the way we should model the interventions of AI in society, or whether the human brain operates by calculation or symbolic representation. As humanities scholars, we also reflect on our forms of knowing. Some of this obviously is quite theoretical and therefore quite contested. I'm not going to get into theoretical issues today, but I want to highlight 3 ways in which we can increase knowledge by studying the past. The first is by increasing what we know, which can be quite literal. For example, we know much more about the poetry of Sappho than we did 150 years ago, thanks to the publication of the papyri found in an Egyptian rubbish dump at the end of the 19th century. We will know much more about the philosopher Philodemus over the next 20 years, thanks to the combination of MRI scanning and AI that is allowing us to read for the first time in 2,000 years the papyrus rolls that were burned in the eruption of Vesuvius. But we don't need actually new discoveries to increase the what of classical learning. Existing evidence can quite clearly be put to new purposes. So that's the what. The second increase is in how we know. We can quite clearly ask different questions of the same body of material. A text might be read, for example, for its literary value, for its evidence for the culture of the time, its evidence for changing linguistic patterns, or its contribution to economic history, whether as a text or as a physical artifact in antiquity. And crucially, new methodologies, new forms of how, if you like, how we know, are emerging all of the time. Recent examples include approaches to ancient literature inspired by cognitive theory and eco-criticism, focusing on what ancient texts can tell us about the relationships between humans and other animals and their relationship to the environment. Digitization is, of course, another step change here, creating huge potentials for rapid searchability, the creation and manipulation of large data sets, and AI interventions. So again, we can change a lot of our knowledge by changing how we know in antiquity. The third way in which knowledge increases is in terms of why we know. All academic knowledge is, to a greater or lesser degree, instrumental. It's produced for a reason, for an individual or social collective purpose. This is as true of the humanities as of the sciences. In the sciences, of course, the practical applications are often more visible and easily grasped, although with the greatest respect, I don't imagine I myself can find practical use for a box that folds up and unfolds when you change the degree of moisture. Fascinating though that example was. Humanities knowledge, though, can be instrumentalized in a practical sense. Of course it can be, but it more commonly intervenes at what we might call the ideological level, and I mean that in a neutral sense. I don't mean that all ideology is bad. I mean that human societies operate with ideology. In other words, when we know things differently about the past, that helps us intervene, it helps us change, or indeed reinforce, prevailing narratives, both about the past and, crucially, about our relationship with the past. That's to say, how we know ourselves in the present. Now, it was the why that first attracted me to the question of the relationship between Christianity and the classical world. I think there are a number of established ways of conceptualizing that relationship, and all of these have, if you like, ideological purchase. Let's begin with continuity, with the idea that the classical world and the Christian world were, in a sense, interlocked, that one developed out of the other. The most dramatic visual example of this that I know of is at the great monastery at Meteora, where a fresco depicts a procession of Christian theologians beginning with the pagan philosophers Plato, Aristotle, and Plutarch. Now, at one level, this follows a very recognized theological position articulated by Clement of Alexandria and others, according to which the inspired philosophers of the pre-Christian past had a presentiment of Christianity. They weren't yet Christians, but they understood the essential features. They were inspired by some sort of divine logos. And one can see immediately why this particular narrative might be celebrated in a place like Meteora. It enables a national story linking the classical to the Christian in the context of Greekness, of a hyper-Greek space. In Northern Europe, by contrast, the Protestant post-Enlightenment tradition tends to play things very differently. It tends to emphasize the difference between the classical and the Christian. This has often taken the form of an exaggerated opposition between the two, as vehicles of, on the one hand, rationality, and on the other hand, superstition. In my country, the United Kingdom, classics as a university discipline emerged at the start of the 19th century under the influence of German models. Classics was then taught more as a science than as a humanities subject. In Cambridge, where I teach now, classics started out as a sub-discipline of mathematics, interestingly. The Christian world, by contrast, was studied in departments of theology, where the sacredness of the texts in question was not interrogated. This led to a strange situation which persists today in Cambridge, for example, of ancient figures who wrote in Greek at exactly the same time, in exactly the same cities, being studied in separate departments, separate buildings, often with completely separate methodologies. So, as I say, that's an ideological story as well, which pulls apart the Christian and the classical. And we can think about the why. We can think about why it was that that situation emerged and under what particular ideological pressures. In this context, the why is also, as I say, very ideological. It reflects the tensions in an era when religion has pushed in one direction and rationalist, progressivist science, in inverted commas, in another. Now, I've sketched two positions: that Christianity was the continuation of classical antiquity and that it was the antithesis of classical antiquity. Now, of course, these are nothing more than sketches. They're caricatures even, and the reality is far more complex than anything I've presented here. But sketches can be helpful in laying out positions to navigate, and more particularly in helping us understand what I've called the why of classical knowledge, the way in which the demands of the present help shape the forms of knowledge that we have about the past. Now, my position is that neither is correct and that we need to move decisively away from such grand narratives. And this is partly a question of restoring the nuance that my sketch sacrificed. As any specialist in the era will tell you, neither classical culture nor Christianity existed in anything like the singular. And there were very many ways, different ways, in which the multiple different communities of Jesus' followers interacted with traditional Greco-Roman culture, from integration to opposition and every space in between. So, as I say, in a way, the reason we need to move away from those grand narratives is simply for, if you like, scholarly nuance, for understanding the texture of the evidence better. But I think there's more to it than that. The reasons for the embedding of Christianity in the Eastern Roman Empire in the first 2 centuries of our era had, I think, little to do with the question of cultural compatibility between the new and the old. It wasn't that Christianity as it emerged either felt radically alien to traditional classical culture or that it felt entirely continuous with it. I think it had more to do with a set of historical factors that all flow back to one figure, and this is where my talk joins up with Professor Papanghelis's. And that one figure is Gaius Octavius, better known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. It was Augustus who, through a mixture of cunning, pragmatism, and force, ended the civil wars that had racked Italy throughout the first century and had politically unified the Mediterranean for the first time when he defeated the forces of Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC. Augustus, I'm going to argue very briefly in the remaining time for me, created both the practical means for Christianity to emerge as a religious force and take the shape it did, and its symbolic structure. What do I mean by practical means and symbolic structure? Well, practical means, first of all, Christianity was the first truly translocal ancient religion. Beginning in the mid-1st century AD, with figures like Paul, it began to split with Jerusalem and spread rapidly across the newly unified Roman Empire. Crucially, it had no cult sites whether central or devolved. It existed within the network itself, so it was quite unlike anything that went before. In terms of the history of Roman religion, this was its chief characteristic and its chief innovation. All other religions were tied to specific sites, whether pilgrimage sites like Jerusalem or specific cult sites dotted around the empire. Paul and his followers exploited the newly built Roman network in direct ways. Let me give 3 quick examples. First, Christian mission was undertaken on Roman roads. Paul's first visit to the Galatians, as described in Acts of the Apostles, followed the Via Sebaster, which Augustus himself had built and was named after the Greek for the name Augustus. That mission would have been impossible without Roman resources. Secondly, Christian communities clustered in imperial metropoles like Rome, Antioch, and in due course, Carthage, the biggest cities in the empire. So Christianity was biggest in the cities where imperial activities, commerce, militarism, and law were at their most intensive. Third, the most important form of early Christian literature was the letter, a technology that depended on the existence of public roads and a functioning postal service. So this is what I mean. These are 3 quick examples of what I mean when I say that Christianity was a religion of the network, and specifically of the Roman network. Even in very simple practical terms, it was dependent on the network that Augustus had built. So much for the practical means that the Augustan Empire supplied for the spread of Christianity into the Roman network. I also said that Augustus offered a new symbolic framework. What do I mean by this? Here we need to think about how Augustus reformed time as well as space. Augustus promised a new era, a novum saeculum in Latin. The word saeculum, which gives us the French siècle, the Italian seculo, and so forth, doesn't in fact mean century. It's an Etruscan word, or a word of Etruscan origin, suggesting a period of cosmic time. So while also promising to restore the Roman Republic, Augustus created a rhetoric of total transformation. We're moving into a new era. And in particular, Augustus himself would be the figurehead of this new age. His image appeared absolutely everywhere. Now, the idea of a new age encapsulated in one figure created what I call the symbolic framework for Christianity. Again, I will have to be brief. Let me just give 2 examples. One innovation of the Christian Gospels, at least those of Matthew and Luke, is the introduction of the Nativity story, centering on the portents and miracles and stories around Jesus' birth. These, I think, were heavily influenced by stories about Augustus's own birth. Just as Jesus was said to be born in Bethlehem, the birthplace of King David, so Augustus was said to have been born in a symbolically important place, Velitri, modern Velletri, about 20 kilometers southeast of the center of Rome. Here, an ancient prophecy predicted that a future world ruler would be born. Shortly after his birth, we're told, a portent was interpreted to mean that nature was pregnant with a king for the Roman people. Since the Senate didn't want a king, it ordered that all the male offspring born at that time should be killed. Now, this has a very close parallel, of course, to Matthew's tale of the massacre of the innocents. And we can be all but certain that the story about Augustus is the older of the 2, not least because Augustus was born 60 years before Jesus. Now, my second example is the set of inscriptions set up all over the Greek-speaking East, proclaiming that from now on, the new year would be celebrated on Augustus's birthday. Augustus, these inscriptions asserted, would be a savior, soter, for mankind, and would bring good news, euangelion, to the world. So Augustus was worshipped in the Greek East as a god, somebody who was a savior god who brought, as I say, good news to the world. Now, this idea of the savior man-god, I'm not saying it directly inspired Christianity, but it paved the way for it and it prepared people's minds for the acceptability of the idea of a human who was also a god who delivered good news. And of course, the word euangelion, evangelion, was taken up in the Gospels and became the signature word of the genre of the Gospels. So I've given you a very quick example of how classical knowledge gets transformed, in this case by changing the what and the how we can tell a new story about the relationship between Christianity and classical culture. By looking at it in terms of changes in political history and bringing in parallels from the world of Augustus. But ultimately, as I've stressed, it's the why of classical knowing that's the most important factor, the most interesting, the most meaningful, the most impactful. It's the why that mobilizes classical understanding in the present and helps us understand not just antiquity, but also our own instincts towards antiquity. You may or may not agree with this account of how Christianity became embedded in the classical world. That's something we can discuss for another occasion. But I hope you will at least agree that changing the what and the how of how we tell these stories also focuses attention on the why, on our own contemporary investments in the past. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Wonderful indeed. Yes. And now the last speech is of paramount importance because, you know, here in Europe, we didn't research at all the Chinese culture, only by the middle of the 18th century. So that we have to learn a lot about this ancient culture. And the Director General of Chinese School of Classical Studies in Athens, Mr. Xinwei, is going to talk about cultural communication across the Eurasia steppe and the origin of Chinese civilization. Please come. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Christo. It's a real pleasure to be here to witness the birth of Koinon as a representative of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I'm an archaeologist, now is the director of also a newly established Chinese School of Classical Study at Athens. So the school was officially announced, the establishment was announced in 2024, in November the 7th, during the conference, the first World Conference on Classical Studies happened in Beijing. This year, the second one will be here in Athens, in this building with a cooperation with the Athens Academy. So, and as an archaeologist, I understand my major is origin of Chinese civilization, and I have been working in Mesoamerica for about 10 years, so I quietly know the importance of the comparison between different civilizations is very important for the understanding of your own civilization. And I also know the importance of communication between the different civilizations for a development of civilizations. The beginning of modern archaeology in China is started by the Sweden archaeologist John Anderson. His excavation in 1921 in central China at the Yangshao site has been regarded as a mark of the origin of modern archaeology in China. John Anderson found some very interesting similarities between the culture he discovered in China, the Yangshao culture. He found the similarities of the painted pottery of Yangshao with the Ano side in Central Asia, and also the Tripoli and the Khotan culture in the north of the Black Sea. So he got an assumption that the earliest Neolithic culture of China came from the West. And now we know it's a wrong assumption, but the good thing is that even at the beginning of Chinese archaeology, we already had a world view, and we already know the importance for the research of your own civilization. You need a comparative image with other civilizations. So he supposes long-distance communication or immigration from the West, the earliest culture of China. Now, after more than 100 years of the beginning of Chinese archaeology, now we have a clear picture of the local origin of Chinese civilization. We already know we have independent agricultural revolution, the earliest domestic millet and rice happened in China 10,000 years ago. And we know that around at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, we can see a quick development of local cultures in these different areas. To the north of China, the Hongshan culture, in the area of Hongshan culture, we found a ceremonial center or sacred ritual center in the mountains with a lot of stone altars and also some tombs of elite people with abundant, very special jade objects to show their shamanistic power to communicate with supernature. And to the north of China, we also found the evidence of social development, such as the Lingjiatan side. We found large tombs with hundreds of jade and stone objects to show the power of the elite leaders of we call that Attic state society. With the jade axe, a symbol of military power, and also this very special jade objects with designs that convey the cosmological knowledge to show the owner of this object has the power, has the shamanistic power to communicate with the supernatural, and also jade figurine to show this shamanistic situation of the leader of Lingjiatan society. But to the lower Yangtze River Valley, we found another way for social development. There are also large tombs in the lower Yangtze River Valley, but the tomb was also with abundant burial offerings. But the main artifacts are this set of ceramic vessels, maybe used in feasting to show a kind of racial feasting, so the local leader can get their power during these feastings a different way. And to the east of China is a very important area. We call that Les Plateau area, highland. We found another way of social development. This area was famous for the painted pottery. And in the central settlements in this area, we found large semi-subterranean houses. I found this big house in 2004. It's 240 square meters inside, maybe even as big as this meeting room. It's a big meeting room for public gathering and maybe certain kind of public ceremony. We also found large tombs in this side, but it's big inside, but inside the tomb there's no luxury food offerings like jade object, no, just some simple potteries. So it's a kind of group-orienting social development strategy that with pay attention on the benefits of the group, but not to show the prestige of certain people. At the same time of the social development, we saw that intensive communication between different regions. We can see the similarities of jade objects from the Hongshan culture to the north and the Lingjiatan culture to the south, a lot of similarities. So we believe that there are already intensive communication between different areas, and this with a long distance exchange of sacred knowledge between the elites of different areas. So that gave birth of a so-called Chinese interaction sphere, or some scholars call that it's a primitive China around the 5300 BC. And after that, we witnessed another development which gave birth of the earliest state-level society in China. It's the Liangzhu culture, the Liangzhu ancient state in the lower valley of the Yangtze River Valley with a large capital city-like settlement is about 300 hectares in size, and a large irrigation system which can benefit the rice field of within 110 square kilometers, and with these large dams to control the waterways, and this reconstruction of this capital city. And we also found large tombs of the Liangzhu, maybe the king of the Liangzhu state, with abandoned even sometimes several hundreds of jade objects. Also with this finely made jade axe to show the military power, but also this kind of, we call that a cong tube. It's a tube-like jade object. It's actually it's an instrument for the Liangzhu ruler to communicate with the supernatural. And with these very finely carved images, it's just about 3 centimeters inside, but in 1 millimeter, they can cover 3 or 4 very thin lines to show is the situation of the Liangzhu ruler who is turning into a bird with a feather head, feather crown, and the arm in the shape of wings, and his leg, his feet, already changed into the claw of the bird, and with the tiger. Tiger is a symbol of the god in the center of the universe who control the movement of the universe. The Liangzhu is almost at the same time of Cyclades culture here, and maybe they have some similarities to pay a lot attention to the religion power for the development of a complex society. At the same time, we can see on the Lurs Plateau area a movement westward to the Western China and development of painted pottery culture. This is the earliest time that we have some earliest evidence of the communication between the East and the West. We can see some similarities of the Chinese painted pottery with painted pottery in the Central Asia, and the earliest copper making knife maybe imported from the Eurasia steppe area. And even some evidence, some real similarities between Chinese painted pottery and this Khotan and Tripoli culture close to the Black Sea. You can see on the top is the Chinese painted pottery, the lower is from the Romania and Ukraine. And you can see the upper part is from China, the lower is from the Black Sea area, the upper China, yeah, a lot interesting similarities. So probably some scholars suggest maybe there are already some early communication across the Eurasia steppe area. But we still need more work to prove that, because in Western China, in the Xinjiang area, we have no similar painted pottery. So there is a big gap between the Central Asia and Central China. Anyway, there are already some interesting evidence. We can see the real evidence, strong evidence of communication between China and the West started around the 4000 BP, 4000 years BP. We imported the earliest wheat and the earliest domestic goat and sheep and cow, and also the technology of bronze making technology. That's gave birth a sharp change of Chinese of the cultural landscape of China. The Lurs Plateau area developed very fast. We found the Taosi site, the north to the southeast of this Lurs Plateau area, large tombs and the early state formation, evidence of early state and the earliest character, Chinese characters. And so after that, we found the establishment of the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, just as a joint point of the highland Loess Plateau and eastern China. And the Aristotle site is a very famous site, have been regarded as the capital of the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, with this palace, foundations of palaces, and also elite burial or ruler of the dynasty with some very finely made, such as this one, the turquoise inlaid dragon-like artifacts. It's almost at the same time with Minoan civilization in Crete island, and actually in both these civilizations, the China and the Crete, we can see some evidence of cross Eurasia steppe communications. And later we have the Shang dynasty, the earliest dynasty with a real writing system, the inscription on oracle bones, and the more elements across the Eurasia steppe, such like that a gold mask found in the very famous Xinwei side, and a lot of bronze, huge bronze vessels at the same time with Mycenae. In Mycenae, we can also see the evidence of across Eurasia steppe communication. So it's a very, very quick comparison between Chinese civilization and ancient Greek civilization. So we know that, we can see that early cultural communication between different civilizations is really important for the development of all the civilizations in the world. So the main mission of my school is to start some archaeologists here. So I'm an archaeologist. We already surveyed in different areas, more than 50 sites across the Greece. And now we already found a good site. The name is Castro in the ancient Aetolia area with cooperation with the Hellenist Ministry of Culture, Dr. Olympia Vicado. We already finished the application and already handed into the Central Committee Archaeological Council. So we hope to start the excavation in April and start some real research of ancient Greek civilization from very basic digging, very basic discoveries of some important artifacts. The school will also organize some important academic events to promote the research on classical studies. And we encourage a comparative perspective on classical studies. We will also have our training program, a visiting scholar program. We are really looking forward for further communication, cooperation with Athens Academy, and we know we are going to learn a lot. We are also hope to share something together to improve our research in ancient Greek civilization. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and we are looking forward to be collaborating in a better way. Anyway, after two very important sessions, we are coming to an end. Thanks a lot for attending these two sessions, and I hope that we have all profit from excellent scholars. Thanks a lot. Στο καλό και θα τα ξαναπούμε. Γεια σας.